Hi, everyone. I see our attendees trickling in. We'll just give people some time. I actually see some familiar names back from Osgood, so it's nice to see you. I will not call you out, but it's nice to see some familiar names in the attendees list. Thanks for being here. My name is Jean-Paul Bevilacqua. I'm a program developer and consultant here at OJEN. And I'm really excited about both our speaker and topic today for a couple of reasons. I mean, I have a personal interest in this topic, but also the timing was great. Justin and I were speaking, and today is Spirit Day, which was an anti-bullying initiative that was started back in 2010 by actually Canadian teenager Brittany McMillan. She created this day in response to lives lost through suicide, the suicides of gay students, including that of Tyler Clementi. And then, yesterday Justin was pointing out to me it was International Pronoun Day. My pronouns are he, him. And earlier this month, just a few days ago, was National Coming Out Day. So to have a webinar that discusses human rights and advocacy issues that are currently facing the 2S LGBTQ plus communities in Canada today is a really great timing for this discussion. Before we get too far into it, Justin and I are actually coming from two different geographic locations today, and as are you all coming from across Ontario, but I am currently in the city that is called Toronto, and I would like to acknowledge that this city is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. It is also covered by Treaty 13, signed with Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. And I'd like to connect this acknowledgement to our discussion today, just briefly before I pass it over to Justin, and specifically the 2S part of our wonderful rainbow alphabet, which pays deference and respect to the concept of two-spiritedness, which is an ancient teaching, and Indigenous elders tell stories of people who were gifted among all beings because they carried both two spirits, those of male and female. It was told and passed down that women engaged in tribal warfare and married other women, and there were men who married other men. These individuals were looked upon as a third gender in many cases, and it's important here that there are, of course, variances in how this concept is talked about and acknowledged and respected through Indigenous communities. But in many of these cultures, they were honored and revered. So I'd like to have that in the forefront of our mind as we talk about the many different communities that make up the rainbow. Today's session will be recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube later on for use in the classrooms. And Justin has kindly offered to send out materials through us afterwards. Something I want to flag for our organization's purpose is the feedback form, specifically the question around next sessions. We have a couple that will close out this calendar year, and I personally would like to hear from you all as to topics that you would like covered, because I'm pretty keen on curating based on the audience's desires and expectations from us and interest from your students. So would love to hear from you both about this session, but also about what you would like to see covered next time. All right, which brings us to today. I was privileged to encounter Justin and his work as a law student myself back at Osgood, and at that point he was with LAWS, which is law and action within schools that delivers workshops and mentoring and a lot of great other programming to high schools that surround the U of T law campus as well as Osgood, and have been following his career and great work ever since. He's a community-focused lawyer and organizer, and he's currently the Canadian Manager of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity at Dentons Canada, one of the world's largest law firms. He's in that role, he's responsible for managing the firm's inclusion, diversity, and equity portfolios across the country's 6 offices. And prior to joining Dentons, Justin made a huge impact in a community center that many in Toronto, including myself, care deeply about, the 519, which is Canada's largest 2S LGBTQ community center, through his role as the Director of Public Interest and Legal Initiatives. We could not really have someone better to be speaking to this topic than Justin, so I'm really grateful in the midst of all his busyness that he's taken this time to both prepare and facilitate our discussion today. And that final note before I pass it over to him, he and I are both keen on making this an interactive discussion, so please feel free to raise your hand or put in the chat or Q&A any questions you may have throughout, but we'll also leave time for questions at the end, and I will kind of moderate those questions throughout the presentation. Thanks so much for being here, everyone. Thanks, Justin, and I'll pass it over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Jean-Paul. Good afternoon, everyone. As Jean-Paul mentioned, my name is Justin Khan, and my pronouns are he and him. Very pleased to be here to speak with you folks today. As Jean-Paul mentioned, I've been connected to OJEN for a number of years, really ever since graduating law school myself, and I'm a true believer and champion for the work the organization does. So really pleased to be here today. The title of my presentation is Pride and Protest, a Celebration or a Fight for Our Rights. Really kind of thinking back to the history of Pride and why Pride started, and really being a protest led by Black, BIPOC, trans, non-binary folks, really carving out the pathway for 2S LGBT inclusion. So I look forward to chatting about that. Before I would like to provide a land acknowledgement. I'm joining the call today from Vancouver. So before I begin my presentation, I would like to acknowledge that I am joining our call from the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And with this acknowledgement, I thank the original keepers of these lands and the Indigenous peoples who live on and care for them today, where I call Vancouver home. So I won't go into too much detail about myself. As Jean-Paul mentioned, I have been connected to 2S LGBTQ communities really since the start of my career, both as a volunteer, dedicated about 3 years of my time with the 519 to build out a large legal department focused solely on 2S LGBTQ communities, and have now shifted over into Dentons, entering a corporate space, recognizing and appreciating that there is a lot of change that needs to happen within the legal profession to be more reflective of the communities and clients that we serve broadly. I also enter this space. I said that I am passionate about 2S LGBTQ issues. I myself identify as a queer person of color. So really a lot of the work that I have done is both professional, but also personal as well, because I stand behind a lot of the advocacy that we'll be chatting about today. And how I keep myself involved in kind of the not-for-profit space is I currently sit on the board of directors for the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity, which has taken intervener status on a few legal cases that we'll chat about later on. I've also recently joined on as the new co-chair of Vancouver Pride Society, so looking forward to doing that work. And interestingly, sit on the National Council for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, who are really kind of human rights defenders. But there are moments in time, and we'll chat a bit about it today, where the CCLA will take very different positions that I or organizations will take when we're talking about human rights issues, particularly as they pertain to 2S LGBTQ communities. So today's conversation, very high level, really want to just kind of set the foundation and talk a bit about the fundamental freedoms that we find within the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Then really turning it over to advocacy issues that our communities are currently facing. Chatting about the ways in which organization and advocates are addressing heightened levels of homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, interpersonal and structural racism, intimate partner violence, and other forms of violence facing our communities, also with a bit of a result of COVID-19. And we'll chat a bit about that, how the pandemic, which is still kind of experiencing the repercussions of that, when we're thinking about marginalized 2S LGBTQ folks. We'll then kind of shift over to talk about a few recent cases that are currently evolving 2S LGBTQ matters, and then chat a bit about how so much more work has to be done. I tend to speak quickly, so please, if I need to slow down at any point, Jean-Paul, you can just raise your hand. I can't see the chat, but also really happy to take questions throughout the presentation if you have questions about some of the specific advocacy issues that we'll be chatting about. So jumping right in, as I mentioned, I won't spend too much time chatting about this, but I think, again, it's important to set the foundations when we think about the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And really its purpose and its design is to protect all individuals who are living in Canada. One of the fundamental pillars that we find within the Charter, as you folks will know, is free speech, which is the right to express yourself and form your own opinions. And it's really an essential feature and staple of democracy. But when we think about free speech, there's often kind of two sides to speech, and oftentimes they can come into conflict with one another. But really thinking about how we are able to form our own opinions and make choices to our core beliefs and what we really stand to believe in. And free speech is found within Section 2B of the Charter. And really, you'll see the quote there: freedom of, I should say, thought, belief, and opinion and expression, including freedom of the press and other media of communication. Moving on, religion is an incredibly important piece. Living in Canada, we are so fortunate to have such a diverse population of folks from across the world. And I think that, really stands for what Canada is. But oftentimes there is conflict between the queer community and religion. And oftentimes what we see, and through my work at the 519, is that many 2S LGBTQ people are attached to their religion because it provides a sense of community. It provides a blanket, a safety. But where the conflict comes in is where religion, where certain religions don't accept 2S LGBTQ folks, and we see that tension with religion and equality. So again, another fundamental freedom that is protected within the Charter and found under Section 2A. And as I mentioned, equality, which we find under Section 15 of the Charter, is designed to protect all individuals in Canada, to provide equal protection and benefit of the law without discrimination based on race, nationality, ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability. And a lot of the human rights cases that we see, whether they're test cases, whether they're organizations who are taking an intervener status, are really what we see is finding that balance. And the court is left to decide kind of on that weighing scale, is equality trumping religion? Is religion trumping equality? But really trying to find that balance or that medium, which oftentimes and more often than not is not the case. And the way that it is designed, there is a winner and there is a loser, and that's why advocacy issues continue to come forward. Again, I won't go too deep into this, but I think it's important to chat about the right to protest. Moving aside from 2S LGBTQ issues, the Black Lives Matter movement really started that movement towards protest. We started to see protest, not only in Canada and America, but across the world. Thinking, if we're being timely, thinking about what's happening in Iran at the moment. So we are fortunate in Canada that we have that right to protest. But we have seen conflict and issues with the police when there are protests, and police oftentimes misuse, abusing their powers to stop protest. But really, protests are, again, a cornerstone of our democracy. And I think it's important to recognize that protests can be messy, they can be disruptive, and that is the point of a protest. But they are crucial to our well-being as a society. We only have that right to vote every few years, but protests in the interim really provide that avenue and that mechanism to dissent against government, to dissent against opinions or unpopular opinions. So again, kind of a staple and a cornerstone to our fundamental freedoms here in Canada.
Justin, I'll say too, it's just something
Sure.
that I think about. It's really, when you put messy and disruptive, my mind went a couple of places, but the first place it went to was the Black Lives Matter protest during Toronto Pride back a few years. Well, it's actually more than a few years, more like 6 at this point. And interestingly, not just, protests can bring up not just conflict between authorities, right? Governments, police, and the aggrieved or marginalized or vulnerable communities, but also the communities within the larger communities, right? So in that case, we had many members who belong to both the 2S LGBTQ community as well as were part of the Black Lives Matter organization. But then you had people who just belonged to one, and then there was tension and dynamics that were I would say inflamed and made for messiness because of disruption there. So protests in and of itself can bring up many different dimensions. That is not just about the powerful and the less powerful, but also the internal dynamics within those protesting.
No, absolutely, and thanks for that point, Jean-Paul. And I think it touches on also the concept of intersectionality, right? Many of us have many different identities and feel connected or an affinity to different parts of their being or their identity. And not only is that conflict disruptive and messy kind of on the outside, but you feel that inner sense of conflict as well, right? As a queer person, I'm always very pleased and excited to see, the Pride Parade and the protests, but completely understood why the Black Lives Matter movement, halted and stopped the parade in its tracks. So, it's an interesting point for sure.
And I don't want to belabor this, but I'll just to share a little bit personally from that. I remember it so vividly. In the days after that parade, I had people in my life whom I love dearly, very close to, but were not part of any of the communities involved, that felt very comfortable weighing in on who they deemed to be right, who they deemed to be wrong, which lines were crossed, as almost an idea that they were allying themselves with me, but not noticing that kind of being treated as a pawn in their argument was actually deeply offensive to me. So I think when we talk about protests here, it's always good. I try to remind myself to check my ideas about who is protesting and the right and wrong ways of doing so, especially if I'm not a central part of those being affected.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, thanks for that. So when we talk a lot about protests, there's a lot of conversation within the legal world around direct action and civil disobedience, which comes up when folks are protesting. And direct action is a very broad term. As you see on the screen, it refers to the use of demonstrations, strikes, boycotts, and other public protests. It's important to note that direct action, may be legal or illegal. It may be violent or it may be non-violent. But its ultimate aim is to bring that public awareness to an issue, or by simply raising that form of intimidation, again, to that kind of unpopular opinion, or to standing against whatever cause or belief that folks are protesting for. Civil disobedience is a public, non-violent, conscientious, yet political act contrary to law, usually done with the aim of bringing about change in the law. So policies of government, response to unpopular views, and by acting in this way, one may address a sense of justice. So when we chat about civil disobedience, one of the most popular examples is thinking about Rosa Parks, who sat at the back of the bus, or who refused, to sit at the back of the bus, which at that point in time, in that moment of history, was illegal for her to do, but in that moment of civil disobedience was using that to make a point for Black equality. When we think about civil disobedience, another example which has just been in the news a few days ago, coming out of London around climate change, folks in the National Gallery throwing soup on multi-million-dollar paintings and gluing themselves to the gallery, again doing something illegal, an act of civil disobedience, but in their minds the aim to bring awareness to climate change. A lot of really interesting arguments coming out of that. So going to spend a bit of time speaking about specific examples of 2S LGBTQ plus advocacy on human rights issues. Most of the examples, or all of the examples we'll chat about, are in Ontario and are also advocacy issues that I have been personally involved with. So if there are questions throughout while we're going through, please feel free to stop me and I'd be happy to chat about that. The first one is the arrival of Chick-fil-A in Canada, which is one of America's most successful fast food chains. and in 2019 actually planned to open their first Canadian location in Toronto, and have since, despite kind of advocacy issues, have expanded quite substantially. I think with a location in Yorkdale now. When I was in Toronto this past week, I saw a brand new swanky location on Queen Street West, and I think they have plans to open 20 more in the province within the next year or so. So with folks, many thought why the 519 was the organization who took the lead on this this piece, and a lot of people were kind of questioning why is a queer organization coming out and taking a stand against a fast food chain. And the issue really is that Chick-fil-A is a very religious-based fast food chain in the United States, and in 2018 donated over $5 million to WinShape, which is a Christian organization in the US, very religious, very right-leaning, and WinShape again takes a lot of that funding, that $5 million, and is actually supporting conversion therapy, which is still happening to this day. And the issue is that we have seen conversion therapy here in Canada, and we'd be remiss to say that American politics aren't leaking into the Canadian sphere. So the 519 again, came out strong on this issue to think about again that tension between equality and religious rights and freedoms, to think about where do we strike that balance. Of course, there are many religious organizations within the country, but when they are openly donating to and speaking against, to us LGBTQ communities, how do we do that? In this issue, the mayor of Toronto actually came out and spoke and said, he didn't want Chick-fil-A to open in Toronto. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe it's Boston, Chicago, and Seattle. Their mayors, their mayors actually did not allow Chick-fil-A to open in those cities, which again caused very interesting legal arguments. And the equivalent of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association in the United States came out strong in support of Chick-fil-A and their rights to be able to open. So it was interesting to see this piece, really gained a lot of media traction, particularly in the United States, because it is apparently, I've never had the chicken myself, but it's supposed to be pretty good. And it's a shame that the organization is able to operate. They made public commitments to stop donating to anti-queer organizations, but in the most recent charitable tax receipts coming out of the United States last year, again a further $1.5 million was donated to the the Christian Fellowship of Athletes, which again has ties to conversion therapy. Questions? I did see that a chat come up, but I haven't been able to read it.
So Justin, Lorraine is just asking, and you touched upon it again, where exactly they donate to.
Yeah, so yeah, very, very right-leaning religious-based organizations that have very openly, if you go onto their websites, onto their mandates, really talk about a traditional family unit, and talks about conversion therapy, and essentially some of the organizations go as far to say to pray the gay away. So Chick-fil-A, again, interestingly enough, also is closed on Sundays, for example. So the American owner has made it very clear that the business is closed on Sundays so that folks are able to go to church and to pray. The next one is in relation to the Toronto Public Library. And this was a number of years ago now, where the Toronto Public Library made the decision to give space to Megan Murphy, who's a well-known trans exclusionary radical feminist, to come in to the Toronto Public Library to give a presentation on one of her most recent essays. And a number of weeks prior to this event, there was actually, because the Toronto Public Library is a city space, you are able to rent space from the Toronto Public Library free of charge, much like you are at the 519, which is the city agency. And halfway through the event, at one of the local branches, they found out that it was a memorial service for a very well-known neo-Nazi. And the librarians were made aware of that and ended up were able to shut the event down, which then started conversations at the board level at the Toronto Public Library to think about space use agreements and rental agreements about that, and made a commitment to look into it But then just a number of weeks after that, Megan Murphy was invited into that space. And this caused a lot of tension within the library community itself. So at the time, I believe her name is Vickery Bowles, who's the chief librarian or the head librarian of the Toronto Public Library, came out strong to say was in support of anyone using that space. And again, interestingly enough, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, who some days are my friend and some days are not, came out strong in support of Megan Murphy under freedom of expression and able to share that. So there was a lot of conversations back and forth, and myself and the board chair at the 519 actually deputed to the Toronto Public Library Board and also to City Council to really think about how they're amending their spaces so that people feel safe. And this one, I think, really struck a chord for a lot of queer folks. When I was speaking with folks, and this is a photo from the event itself in Toronto, is that a lot of queer people use the library as a safe space. That is where they go to find out about the history of queer folks, where they're able to seek protection. It was disappointing that the figurehead of the library was saying, well, no, actually, we need to allow this event to go on. And again, I think this really demonstrated a sense of community. And following the event, the 519 hosted Transcend and Transform, which was led by trans and non-binary authors, activists, to really continue to raise awareness about queer literature and why we need to be promoting that and not anti-trans poetry, not poetry, kind of essays.
Justin, can I just jump in here?
Please.
And not to be argumentative, but I would like to present the argument that, or how would you respond to the idea? Well, clearly, Megan Murphy is not going to be invited to the 519 to speak anytime soon. What is wrong with her having her own space to express herself and her beliefs? She's not coercing anyone to be there. Why prevent her that platform?
Yeah, so I don't think it's about preventing the platform necessarily. Again, when I think about that kind of balancing act, that freedom of expression, Megan Murphy is well within her legal rights to hold a specific point of view. I think where the argument got pretty interesting is that it's a city space, it's a public space, and that the city has very clear anti-discrimination and anti-harassment policies that for some reason were not applying to the Toronto Public Library's decision to allow, a certain speaker into their space. I think if it was in a private space, a private event, if it was a private space within a private organization, of course, the 519 or queer organizations or activists would go out and protest against that and would have no real ground to make that argument. But the fact that it is a city space with clear mandates, I think that's where the legal tension started to come into play.
Thanks, that's great.
Oh, sorry. Yep, yeah. So the next piece is around the Toronto Catholic District School Board. In 2019, there was a motion to update the code of conduct to be more inclusive and protective of 2S LGBTQ+ students. And wanted to add the terms gender identity, gender expression, family status, and marital status into the code of conduct. And it's important to note that the changes passed the vote 8-4, but there was quite a bit of controversy around it. So at the then vice chair, Mike Delgrand, stood up to move an amendment asking for several other terms to be included into the code of conduct, including, and I'm not joking when I say bestiality, pedophilia, terms related to rape, cannibalism, and vampirism. So essentially saying, folks within the queer community are, pedophiles, attributed to rape, to cannibalism. It was completely bizarre and obnoxious. And again, thinking about the argument, well, it is a Catholic school board, freedom of religion, they are able to, is that the Catholic School Board, the Toronto Catholic School Board, is a publicly funded institution. So again, that interesting argument there. But Del Grande again stood hard against his position to want to include those terms alongside gender identity, gender expression, and although the motion did pass for those terms to be the pro-queer terms to be included into the code of conduct. but a number of individuals and organizations did depute to the Toronto Catholic District School Board because even though the terms that he was proposing would not be in the code of conduct, that rhetoric is still there, right? There's you have students who will see these proceedings and say, do I feel safe coming out in my Catholic school board? What does a code of conduct really mean to a 15, 16-year-old, 17-year-old student? They want to feel accepted regardless of what is written on paper. And that was a big point of our deputation at the time, to really to understand that cannot continue. So yeah, again, it didn't come into, it wasn't codified, but again, it was interesting to see that words like that would even be contemplated by the vice chair of the Toronto Catholic District School Board. Another one, again, really looking at the pandemic, and I apologize that the S there is small, it should be capitalized, and I'll make that amendment. But really thinking about local businesses I personally have spent a lot of time in the Church Wellesley neighborhood in Toronto, the Village. It has been a safe space for many people for many years. We've continued to see a lot of businesses close pre-pandemic, and the pandemic only exacerbated the closure of many local businesses. So the 519 at the time wrote to all levels of government, so municipal, provincial, and federal, asking for the government to take immediate action to save not only TUS LGBTQ and queer trans-owned local businesses, but local businesses generally. And although I don't live in Toronto now, I lived there for many years, is that the Village is just one street, Church is just one street. But I have, if you spend any time on Queen West, it's now known as Queer West, and many businesses continue to close. Many safe spaces, for example, the Beaver on the west end of Toronto was a very popular queer bar. Sweaty Betty's, which is another very queer-friendly place, was very close to closing because of the pandemic. And the reason why this sparked it is Sadiq Khan, who I'm not sure if he's the mayor of London anymore, London, United Kingdom, but at the time was the mayor, and actually created an economic fund to specifically support TUS LGBTQ-owned businesses who are disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. We have seen the government bail out many sorts of organizations and businesses, but really thinking about the importance of these safe spaces for queer folks to be able to seek refuge, to seek safety. Nothing came of it, unfortunately. It wasn't acknowledged. It was acknowledged by Councillor Wong, or then Councillor Wong Tam, I should say, who has been very supportive of TUS LGBTQ issues. But again, it was a lot of lip service saying, we will continue to encourage people to support these businesses, but we don't have the resources available to actually put together a pot of money or funding to save businesses. Again, related to the pandemic, it's no secret that throughout the pandemic, we have seen a rise in hate, particularly against the TUS LGBTQ community, and to narrow that down even more, particularly around marginalized queer folks, particularly trans folks. And in this instance, we saw that rise in hate and came out together with the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, writing to the Prime Minister to really highlight the levels of abuse, particularly within urban communities in Canada. And when we talk about a lot of these, when we think about the lockdown, for example, it was very specific that you had to stay within your family unit during the core of the lockdown. But the definition of family and family unit is very different for a traditional family compared to queer folks, right? You have a chosen family. A lot of young folks, and I think particularly to smaller towns across the province and across the country, we're essentially, in a lockdown in a home where their parents or their caregivers may not be accepting of who they are as an individual, which in turn, increases to, instances of self-harm, of abuse, of harm generally. So thinking about that rise and that hate, again, and I haven't included in this presentation, but encampments really came up quite substantially throughout the pandemic. The police services, Toronto Police Service bylaw office, enforcement officers sending eviction notices to people who were living on the streets. And the reality is, the argument against that was, well, the city said, well, we provide shelter space to folks who are living on the streets or who are street involved. But the reality is particularly for trans folks, is that people do not feel safe within the shelter system. They experience heightened levels of transphobia, of homophobia, and then are moving to the streets, and then are then being ticketed for being on the streets or for being within encampments. So thinking about how these tickets or these bylaw violations were disproportionately impacting street involved folks who don't have the luxury of a roof over their heads.
And of course, implied in what Justin is saying is the overrepresentation of 2S LGBTQ plus folks in the homeless population, right? I think it's
absolutely.
There are stats that say that I believe one of the most quoted ones that 25% to 40% of youth without homes are LGBTQ2 plus individuals.
Correct. Yeah, and then even higher when we look at trans and non-binary individuals as well. So it's the reality is grim. Next up is really the Toronto Police Services, and we'll touch on the TPS in a few instances, but this one was one that was pretty problematic. So in October 2020, a 2S LGBT organization became aware of the death of a member of its community while in police custody. And although neither the TPS or Ontario Special Investigations Unit and the SIU, if folks aren't aware, they are an independent body that is called upon if there is a death within police custody, if a firearm is used by a police officer, the SIU is always invoked. That's their mandate, to do an investigation as to why did a police officer use their weapon? Why did someone die in police custody? They say it's an independent unit, but a lot of the folks who are investigators on the SIU are actually retired police officers or who have strong ties to police services. So although the Toronto Police Services and the SIU didn't release any information about this individual who died, the organization, that the 2S LGBT organization, did receive that information through another channel, and it confirmed that it was the death of a 30-year-old Black trans woman. However, when the SIU completed their initial report, they had mentioned that a Black male had died in police custody, although this trans individual had legally changed their sex designation on their documents. So the two weren't coming together. And again, a really strong issue around trans inclusion. And why do we have trans ID clinics? Why are trans individuals afforded the right to change their sex designation, have legal name changes, if when they end up unfortunately in this case, in a morgue, into the SIU's investigation, was identified as a Black male, a Black 30-year-old male. So again, it caused deep kind of harm to the trans community, which again, when we think about even the access to healthcare for trans folks, right? Many trans folks are not going to hospitals to receive care for or treatment for whatever the issue may be, because they face heightened levels of transphobia within these types of institutions. So in this instance, I had much involvement with the SIU, and finally got them on board to think about how we are honoring and dignifying individuals who died, particularly within the 2S LGBT community, and actually amended their initial report to reflect the identity of this individual, and actually agreed to do education and training around 2S LGBT inclusion. So that was a small win in this instance, but again, one that causes harm to our trans communities. Next up is Canada Christian College, which folks may have heard about, was a university that was set to open in Ontario. I believe it was Oshawa, but I'm not too sure. So individuals on the call may be aware of Trinity Western University, which is a university here in BC, who was hoping to open a law school and have that accredited by the Law Society here in BC. But part of their code of conduct said that students had to, weren't able to engage in sex, were not able, did not believe in same-sex marriages or same-sex relationships. And it led to a very large case in the Canadian context. And ultimately, Trinity Western was not given permission to accredit their law school. So that was a big win for 2S LGBTQ organizations, and at the time was what we thought set precedent in this instance where institutions, educational institutions, had to factor in Section 15 equality rights. Canada Christian College came along, and I'm not sure what would have been, I suppose, the dean or the individual who was really leading the charge of Canada Christian College was actually really good friends with Premier Doug Ford in Toronto. And what Doug Ford did really kind of pushed through an omnibus piece of legislation, Bill 213, which had nothing to do with Canada Christian College, but sought to accredit the college. Again, following very similar mandates to what Trinity Western was doing around not kind of believing in same-sex marriages, relationships, abstaining from sex or same-sex sexual partners, etc. And the individual, I believe, his name is on the screen, Charles McVeety, is a very outspoken individual when it comes to 2S LGBTQ inclusion. Again, another win. Ultimately, the college did not receive its accreditation, but the fact that this came to light and came to surface after we saw what happened at Trinity Western was, again, a small step back, right? There was that issue of, well, we thought that this has been dealt with. We see the legal precedent that this wasn't allowed to happen. And then, Doug Ford at the time really trying to sneak in the accreditation through Bill 213 at the time. I won't touch too much on this one. I talked about kind of the increased lockdown and how that disproportionately affects, 2S LGBTQ folks within their mandates. Because I'm not sure if individual remember is that the Mark Sargent at the time, TPS, gave information to all officers within the Toronto Police Services. They could stop anybody on the street to ask what they were doing, where they were going during that lockdown, and obviously immediately raises issues around carding. Who are police officers stopping? Why are they stopping them? Are they disproportionately stopping BIPOC folks, queer folks, particularly trans folks? So that went ahead, but was very quickly shot down. And many organizations, many pro bono lawyers in Ontario were saying if individuals have been charged and or ticketed and need legal assistance, that they could get in touch immediately to provide that support in relation to that increased lockdown. I believe this is the second last one around advocacy. Again, Hanlon's Point, and for those who aren't aware, Hanlon's Point again has been known as a safe space for queer communities for many years, and is actually where Toronto's first Pride through Toronto Gay Action, I believe, 41 years ago, held its first Pride. And throughout the pandemic, again, continuing to see a rise in hate and towards 2S LGBTQ communities. And in 2021, a young, I believe he was only, 21 to 25-year-old, was viciously attacked on his way back to the ferries to leave Hanlon's Point. And again, just raised alarm bells throughout the queer community where, what we thought were safe spaces aren't safe anymore. And again, just having that increased homophobia, transphobia, biphobia was again something that many organizations, whether it be the 519, EGAL, small organizations, are really coming out against that increase in that rise in hate. The next one is the independent civilian review into the missing persons investigations, and this is a result of the Bruce McArthur case. And I won't go into detail because we could spend hours talking about the Bruce McArthur case, but ultimately, long story short, for years, people within the queer community were telling the police, our friends are missing. And majority of the folks who were missing were newcomers to Canada, right? They were BIPOC folks. And then ultimately, what led to Bruce McArthur's, arrest was that there was an individual who was reported missing. That individual who was reported missing was well known within the queer community and so happened to be white as well, which then kind of raised, the Toronto Police Services were immediate to respond. Coming out of the Bruce McArthur case, it really showed huge deficiencies within the Toronto Police Services and how they were conducting missing person investigations. Very similarly to this, in the case of R.V. Schlater, there was the death of a young woman by the name of Tess Ritchie in Toronto, who was on a night out in the village, was at a bar called Cruise, and was murdered less than 100 feet from where she was last seen. And again, Tess was a sex worker in the city, was a member of the queer community, and it took her mother traveling from North Bay to come to Toronto, and it was her mother who found her daughter's body at less than 100 feet from where she was last seen. And this was, I believe, 6 days after the missing persons investigation was opened. So as a result of that, Justice Epstein, who is a former appellate court judge in Ontario, was brought on to lead a review into TPS's missing persons investigations, and ended up coming up with 151 recommendations as to why the TPS, was not engaging in missing persons investigations. And interestingly enough, the police came out almost immediately after the release of that report and said, we will agree to all 151 recommendations. Which was quite surprising and what many people think is an empty promise. And before leaving Ontario, I was a part of the task force that was involved in ensuring that the TPS agrees to these 151 recommendations alongside Justice Epstein. And to this date, we have seen very little progress, which leads to the conversations again and again. Is the Toronto Police Services, making false promises? And is it only a matter of time until another queer person goes missing, is ultimately, murdered, and we find ourselves in the same position as the victims of Bruce McArthur or the victims of Kaylin Schlater? So, what I said at the time when I, speaking with the news and speaking on this issue is that we're cautiously optimistic. The police chief at the time made that commitment, and organizations in Toronto will hold the police accountable, and it's something that we need to see. I'm just going to wrap up. I know that we are slowly running out of time, but just a few cases that are all very recent and are ongoing that have made their way into the court system. The first one was led by AGAL, which is a 2S LGBT organization, I think I mentioned, really focused on advocacy and made an application to the Ontario Superior Court to challenge the constitutionality of exemptions in the criminal code that permit normalizing surgeries on intersex infants and children prior to these individuals being able to make decisions themselves. So at the moment, if a child is born intersex, the parent or the legal guardian is able to medically, give permission for that individual to undergo surgery. What a lot of queer organizations are arguing is saying that it should be the right of that individual. We have autonomy over our own body, and individuals should have that right, should be able to make that right when they are of age to do so or understand what that means. So the case is ongoing. We still don't know the outcome, but it's an interesting argument, right, around the rights of a parent or a caregiver towards the right of yourself and your one being. Another one is a factum to the Ontario Supportive Court on Equal Protection for Trans and MSM men who have sex with men, sex workers. Again, the law around sex work is very complicated. It's very it's complex, but again, disproportionately, it does affect particularly trans folks and those who are men having sex with men. And the Canadian human rights organizations are taking a stand alongside trans and MSM individuals to defend their rights to equal protection under the law. We have seen advancements made around sex work, but again, there's that disproportionate negative consequences for trans folks. So we'll continue to see how this case unfolds through the Canadian Alliance for Sex Work Law Reform. And the last is one that has happened really within the last few days, and it is a Supreme Court case, which is based out of BC. And the kind of story behind this is Glenn Hansman is a teacher. He's a gay man and the former president of the BC Teachers Federation. And he was contacted by members of the media to comment on Mr. Nuffield's statements. Mr. Nuffield was a trustee of the school board and made very anti-2S LGBTQ statements. And among those remarks, he alleged that Mr. Nuffield was creating an unsafe environment, both for teachers and for students, and that his comments actually tiptoed quite far into hate speech. And to prove hate speech legally in Canada, it's very difficult to do. And then essentially Nuffield is now suing the teacher for defamation, saying that those comments are affecting his reputation as a trustee. And the reason why it's made its way to the Supreme Court is around anti-slap legislation in BC, and I won't go into detail, it's pretty complex. But again, we're seeing an issue now making its way to the Supreme Court of Canada around, there's issues around that legislation, but also issues around hate speech and around counter speech. And counter speech, again, I think is a way to defend yourself against hate speech. And it brings in that legislation. So this one is an interesting case. Judgment has been reserved, and it'll probably be a number of months before we find out. But again, will be a bit of a game changer in relation to thinking about how free speech and hate speech kind of conflict with one another. So interested to see how that one will come out. So those are just three kind of high-level examples. We spent a lot of time talking about advocacy issues, but these issues are making their way into the court system. And the fact that they are, finding themselves in a superior court, moving to a court of appeal, and now to, the highest court of our land, shows that there is a lot of work that needs to be done to protect 2S LGBTQ communities. So the last piece that I have, I always kind of end my conversations and talking about allyship and thinking about how, as educators, as teachers, as just members of society, how we can get involved. Allies are critical to helping and supporting 2S LGBTQ communities, and really allies act as a bridge in these conversations needed to increase awareness and acceptance on 2S LGBTQ issues. And it really shows that these communities are not alone in their struggle for equality. And, as I mentioned, I started our conversation today being very open about my own sexuality. And through my work with the Law and Action Within Schools program and spending, a number of years in schools, being very open about that, and seeing youth come up to me and, wanting to have conversations about being a member of the community, or how can I be an ally? And the fact that many students are talking about allyship, I think, they are the future. They are the ones that will be, moving this forward. So, that's the end of my presentation. I know that I sped through it and kept it very high level, but it's been a pleasure speaking with everyone, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Justin. So yes, please throw any questions in the chat or the Q&A. I would just like to remark just on that last allyship slide, as we're speaking to educators here, being an ally in a classroom, can be in big ways, and talking about big topics and making sure that certain subjects and perspectives are covered in class. It can also be about welcoming the student who brings his People magazine post-Oscar edition to talk to the teacher about what he was enjoying on the weekend, as I did as a kid, and welcoming those types of interactions that may not particularly be normal or part of the regular way of interacting with certain students, but welcoming different ways of being a child and being a young person, and engaging with those who might be seeking connections in different ways. Questions? I think there's one in the Q&A. Okay, we got a longer one here. So let me read it out for you. Justin, can you speak to the value of sharing pronouns? How do we do this thoughtfully and meaningfully so that it isn't just a checkbox item? Yeah, actually, I was having this thought as this person went on to their next part of the question. I'm thinking about potential parallels with land acknowledgements.
Yeah.
How encouraged to put some thought into making land acknowledgements instead of using one standard phrase. There's similar concern with how we share pronouns. Thank you for that question. That's great.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks. Thanks. I can't see the name of who sent it, but thanks for sending that in. And I was going to make that immediate parallel to land acknowledgements as well, right? It's become so commonplace. And interestingly enough, when I started to see land acknowledgement come into play when I was working with the Law and Action Within Schools program, and all of a sudden it starts to come on the announcements. I believe like after the national anthem, et cetera. And I was like, well, why are these there? There has to be context, and I think that's the important piece, whether it be land acknowledgements or pronouns, is why are we doing this? And having conversations around why pronouns are important. And I lean it back to, it's just around to human dignity, right? I may look a certain way. I present as a cisgender male, right? That not may be what my identity is on the inside. And when we think about allyship, when we think about these conversations, is how do we make people feel included within our societies? And then one of the questions is, well, it's awkward, right? It's awkward asking a pronoun, right? So, and I always open up conversations when I'm in a meeting with somebody new. Hey, my name is Justin, my pronouns are he and him, which is kind of an open invitation for someone to then provide their pronouns in return. But I think, again, it's around the conversations on why are we talking about pronouns? And then it kind of sparks a larger conversation, which opens up, the pathway into thinking about how we are engaging in conversations with non-binary and trans folks. And I'm happy to there is an amazing one-pager, and again, I'm plugging the 519 because I used to work there, but a really great one-pager that I've shared with many educators around what are pronouns and what are their importance. A very simple one-pager infographic sheet, which talks to that, to that issue about, why are we talking about gender pronouns and why are they important? And for example, in my email signatures or across Denton's as a whole, we have the option to include our pronouns, but then have it hyperlinked to that resource so that individuals can understand, why we're having pronouns. With land acknowledgements, similarly, and I engage with Indigenous colleagues, I engage with Indigenous leaders within the communities, and I understand and respect that it's not for an Indigenous person to give a land acknowledgement. I'm a settler on Indigenous lands. It's for me to give that. So also being mindful about thinking about when I'm crafting a land acknowledgement or when I'm speaking a land acknowledgement, trying to bring a personal aspect into it, right? When I gave my acknowledgement at the start is that I'm grateful to be on these lands. Vancouver, British Columbia, in my opinion, is one of the most beautiful provinces. I'm lucky to be here on these lands, and I always try and tie in that personal aspect as well when I'm doing an acknowledgement.
Thank you, Justin. I appreciate you reflecting on that. Justin and I were on the same page. Justin and I have that resource queued up, so I put it in the chat. And yeah, really great suggestions about hyperlinking to that resource. I'm going to do that myself. Any final questions from the floor? I just like to say for me, this presentation was useful and appreciated in a couple different respects, but it just reminded me of the importance of intersectionality. So many of the different conflicts, fights, grievances involved communities that we would necessarily connect to the 2S LGBTQ plus communities, but realizing that members of our community form members of that community, but also that we are connected in that fight to justice and for freedom, and realizing that interconnectedness. You really made that clear for me in the audience. So thank you so much, Justin. Awesome. A question in the Q&A. Okay, so this will be our last one. Okay, Lorraine, thank you for this. There's a long history of police brutality, neglect, and disparity in treatments against 2S LGBTQ plus communities, but many white cis members of the community don't remember or don't understand this historical context, and we wind up seeing white supremacy and cis normativity to take hold in the discourse. Could you comment? We talked a little bit about that, Justin, when about the Black Lives Matter protests at Pride, but if you have any final thoughts on that.
Sorry, it's about the kind of the historical context and why it's kind of not been spoken to, or?
Yeah, and then just the kind of the tendency to blame other communities when they're fighting for their own communities. Yeah,
I have a lot of thoughts and opinions, but I'm terribly sorry that I have an external meeting that I have to attend. But I'd be more than happy to comment on that question right after my next meeting and share that with you to share with the question that came up.
Thanks so much, Justin. I appreciate you making the time. Please go to your to your next.
Yes, I'm so sorry that I have to rush off for my next meeting.
No, we appreciate you fitting us in, and we'll share Justin's material later on. See you, Justin.
Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
Thanks for being here, everyone.
Take care.
Please do fill out the feedback form and let us know what you'd like to see for the rest of the year. Bye, everyone.